Welcome to Tramlines, a podcast from Agrii. I'm your host, Tony Smith, putting your questions to the experts. Today we're going to be talking with David Purdy, Territory Business Manager for East of England for John Deere, and Steve Corbett, Trials Manager at Agrii. With a backdrop of a very wet winter, some fields need re-drilling, and in other fields we need to establish a spring crop. But how do we approach soils this spring to maximise crop performance in this very challenging season? So good morning to you both. Steve, perhaps we can start with you. I know that you've been out on farm digging soil pits. What are you finding? How is the soil looking? How are those fields looking right now?
From the position we're at, Tony, essentially that will differ on different soils, different locations, etc. But there's one thing I must say at the start: we cannot go into this spring simply just putting a crop in the ground because that's our farmer hat on. We have to have a crop that is going to make a margin, and so that to me really drives now some of these very, very difficult decisions that we have in front of us. Some fields have still got water on. That's due to whether it be the River Trent or whichever river still flowing out of its boundaries. And that we can't do a lot about. But there is a lot of land then that is started to drain, depending on drainage systems, ditches, etc. And they, of course, the first thing to get moving. We've got to get this water moving and then start the next process, which really is a field by field check on soil condition.
And Steve, I can really hear the seriousness in your voice by which you're sharing this information. I can see that this is, and I can hear this is very important. David, I know you cover generally the East of England. What are you noticing on farm as a result of what's happened following this winter?
Yeah, well, much like Steve, really, we're seeing, vast amounts of fields, not perhaps underwater, but certainly well above field capacity at saturation point. And although, the last few days we've seen some drier weather and we've seen some brave people make some brave steps, as it were, we've still got fields that are, holding a lot of water. And it will vary depending upon the kind of autumn treatment that those fields have. If you've got very heavily worked fields, whether they be drill fields that you might need to re-drill or whether they were always destined for spring cropping, those soils are going to be particularly fragile to machinery, shall we say. So you've got to be very, very careful. If you've got fragile soils, high moisture content, and then you start, especially if it's heavy soils, you start putting big, heavy machinery on top of that, and you don't pay real attention to detail when setting that machinery, we can talk more about that later on, then, very quickly you're going to be in some real challenging situations. But then, you've got to look at what your autumn cultivations were. If you were sort of much more minimal cultivations, there's a chance that those soils will be slightly more resilient, slightly stronger in strength and able to be much more supportive to machinery. So I think for me, it's really understanding, obviously field by field, as Steve said, soil type by soil type, but also what treatments, if you like, or what cultivation treatments those fields have, because that's going to really play a fairly big role in how they're going to handle machinery.
Yeah, sure. Just picking up on what you've both talked about, which is actually that these soils are in a fragile state. Can we just understand what does that actually mean in terms of the impact on the crop that you're putting in the ground? So, Steve, what does this fragility mean in terms of what's happened over winter?
So digging holes this last week, what I've seen and totally agree with David is really probably three different scenarios. One is where tons of water have pounded the top surface and we have a fragility, a layer of 3-4 inches that has really been put together, whether that's been the silt that's shifted or simply the soil put together. So that is one scenario. Underneath that, very often, and depending what cultivation or indeed direct drilling or whatever it was, the approach was, very often underneath that layer in this scenario, soil structure is good. So that is the soil strength, the inherent soil strength that has kept that soil structure further down intact. Now that is one scenario that we can approach. The next one, as David said, if we've got deep cultivations and cultivations that's happened to now a deeper profile, That is called, we put a lot of air into it. That air has now been replaced by water, depending on where the silt shifted to as well. That is a more difficult scenario to deal with. And the third one in my book is where we've now got a failed crop, because we've not only got the soil structure, we've got any other residue, debris, etc. We've got herbicides, etc. So the failed crop scenario in the conditions that we have is the really most difficult one in my book, Tony.
And David, what are you noticing that's different between the different soil types as to how those fields are looking?
Well, I think you do see the differences now, and as Steve says, you can dig a hole, and very, very often you find, you know, very wet soils, but that gradient of moisture, if you like, runs out really quickly, and still, even today, I mean, a lot of it goes back to last summer. Still, there's relatively dry soils beneath, so you know, you have got that scenario. And I think one part of it is looking back, but we've got to look forward as well, because I can be pretty sure, I think would all put money on the fact that these soils in a few weeks' time will dry out very, very quickly. And if you've got soils perhaps with a high silt content, and you know, there's a very good chance that, you know, in a few weeks' time, or say let's call it April, May time, those soils will dry out, and we'll get all sorts of cracking, and especially if those soils haven't seen a great deal of movement. You know, if you're coming from a very, very low disturbance kind of philosophy, then you're going to run into soils. So you've got to kind of not only deal with what's been, but you've got to just kind of think of what's coming as well. And those two scenarios are pretty challenging to deal with, but there are strategies obviously that we can employ, really.
And Steve, I can see you're thinking there, wanting to add a little bit more to what David has just shared. What are your thoughts?
Well, as David mentions there, and this is a soil at field capacity, we're talking 25% water, 25% air within the makeup. 45% would then be the mineral. We can't do anything about that. And then there's the organic content. So in that scenario I just painted, we'd be 5% organic. That really then starts to give me a clue as to maybe what we can do with that soil. If it's at that sort of state, field capacity, then we can move forward. I think we can understand what it is we're trying to do.
Right. And so from that perspective, where do we start in terms of finding our strategy for approaching whatever we are seeing on our individual farm?
Yeah, so I think, you know, obviously a spade is really, really useful. You can make some sort of, visually, once you get a feel for soils visually, you can really assess whether a soil is at field capacity or not. You can use a penetrometer, which is a device you push into the soil and kind of simulates the kind of a root moving through soil, and field capacity is around about 200 psi. So it's a good indication, as all these things are an indication of the state of the soil.
So, Steve, listening to you both, where you're talking about understanding the soil and its fragility, where do we start in terms of thinking and planning as to which fields we're going to start our field operations in first?
So first steps for me are, where is the water going off the field? And often that ditch is full of debris, whatever. Can we get that water moving? Can we get the drains flowing? Where are the outlets for things like mold, for instance, if the soil's been mold drained? So in other words, can we improve or speed up the water movement? If we can start that at least, the drying conditions or dry air conditions then will come. But importantly, as David said, we want to make a pretty rapid start here, because I don't want to go headlong into a very dry period and see things go completely up the other way. So it's really starting on it now. So it's not waiting in the farm office or driving around roads. It's where's that water? What level are the ditches at? Can we get that water moving before we start anything?
And David, what would help you make the right decisions as to whether you travel on those fields?
It comes down to some very simple principles, I think, at the end of the day. But, you know, just taking soil and rolling it in your hands in a kind of worm-like structure will tell you a lot about the kind of, we call that friability of soil. But, you know, if that soil, and obviously different soil types will behave differently here, but if you're on heavier soils with any amount of clay in there, then, you know, that doesn't kind of start to break nicely when you roll it in your fingers. If it stays as a kind of solid worm, then that probably isn't the right field to start your drilling, if that makes some sort of sense. So I think, you know, you've got to understand, but that will also change in the course of a day. So you might go out in the morning and you might that might not kind of be friable, but then after lunch, that same soil a morning's worth of drying makes a huge difference. And so I say to a lot of people, in the spring, drilling in the afternoon is a whole lot better than drilling in the morning. And if you've got, if those tires on your tractor and your drill are starting to print the soil, as we call it, then you can go back in the afternoon and it works just fine. So even the time of day now, if you've got a dry day, makes a huge difference to drilling conditions and soil conditions, really. So I think it's making some sort of just basic assessments, rolling some soil in your hands, just making sure it's friable, it's not going to stick to everything. If it is going to stick to everything, just don't go there. You're going to cause such a mess that you'll regret it for the rest of that cropping cycle, if you like. But very often you can go back in the afternoon and that same field will drill really, really well. So it's short windows, but I think it's making those sort of assessments. So that's the first thing really around just deciding which field you can actually and the time of day you can actually go drilling.
You may find other episodes here on Tramlines useful. Direct Drilling, a field scale experiment with Andrew Ward and Agrii, and Getting Down to Earth with Direct Drilling. Links can be found in the podcast bio. And so we've decided to go into that field and carry out some cultivations or drilling. David, what key elements do we need to really think about in terms of machinery setup?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that, your attention to detail here is super critical, and you can make a really good job of spring drilling, or you can make a pretty average job of spring drilling just by a relatively few settings on the tractor or the drill, really. So you can make it's in your hands to make a huge difference. And I think the first thing I kind of try and talk about is a power to weight ratio of the tractor. So when we're drilling, and this is slightly technical, but it's in the back of most machinery operators' book. It's certainly in the back of most technical manuals around tires. Is we want to kind of have the right weight to do the job. We don't want to be too heavy. We don't want to be too light. If you're too light, you get wheel slip. If you're too heavy, you sink into the soil. So you want around about 45 kilograms per horsepower. So that's a really simple piece of maths. You just take the horsepower off the bonnet, times it by 45, and that's the total weight you want that tractor to be at. And you don't really want any more than 45 for drilling. For heavy draft applications, when you want to put all that power to the ground, then you go over 50. But for drilling, you don't want to be any more than 45, because if you do, then you're carrying far too much weight. That burns fuel, so it's an economic thing. But more importantly, it will damage the soil and print the soil and do exactly as what Steve says when it comes dry, which I think we all have to kind of make that assumption it probably will. The drill slots, if it's a disc drill or whatever, will start opening, and you get very poor establishment, and that's where you get no competitiveness amongst the plants. So you get weeds growing there, all sorts of things. So I think real attention to that. So the first thing is to get the power to weight ratio, and then the second thing is to put that weight in the right place. So we always talk about machinery a sort of 60-40 split, 60% of that weight over the rear axle, 40% over the front axle. And you've got to remember the first pass always does the most damage. And the first pass is not the tractor, the first pass is the front axle. And very, very often, almost too frequently, people are overloading front axles of tractors. Yes, if you've got a fully mounted drill, sometimes you need to do that to manage things at headlands. But very often people are putting too much weight on the front of the tractor, and therefore more power is trying to go through the front axle than it should do, and less is going through the rear axle. And then you get wheel slippage, and you're not effectively managing the power or the weight, and that causes all sorts of problems to our soils, really. So I think it's just really recognizing that how much weight you need, where you put it, and then of course it's about tire pressures, and tire pressures this time of year when you do spring drilling will make a absolutely massive difference. But that's going to come to how much weight is on the tractor. But all the tire companies out there are usually only too happy to come and help you get your tire pressures right. Of course, if you've invested in things like VF tires, these very highly flexible tires, and you can drop your tire pressures down. So I always say for drilling is you want to try and get your axle weights below 6 tons and your tire pressures below 10 psi. Because if you can drive those two things, then and you've got, as Steve says, that friable soil, and it's not it's just nicely at field capacity or just beyond field capacity, then you'll make a really good job of spring drilling. But if you get any of those kind of wrong, then you can quickly get yourself into some trouble, basically.
So it clearly is well worth that time spent in the yard right now, setting up your kit properly, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. You've probably got a bit of time on your hands. You can't get into the field right now. Just go through that thing. There's a simple piece of maths which I try and teach everybody, but it's how to work out weight transfer. So if you're hanging, people will go to Llama this week and probably see lots of big, fancy, heavy weights. But if you hang a 1 ton weight on a front linkage on the front of a tractor, if you do the simple sums, you take the distance from that weight to the distance of the front axle. That's usually about 1.5 meters. You take the wheelbase of the tractor. That's usually about 3 meters on most tractors. You take 1.5 divided by 3. That's 0.5. You times it by the weight, so you put a ton on there. That's another 1/2 ton of weight transfer. So instead of putting a ton on the front of the tractor, you've actually put 1.5 tons on that front axle. And for every that weight transfer that goes on the front axle, it's going to come off. It's going to unload the rear axle. So you end up with the front axle doing far too much work, the rear axle not doing enough work. The front axle's the first pass in the field. It does most damage. And, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to see where that kind of scenario takes you in.
And Steve, if we reflect on the direct drilling trials that you and Andrew Ward conducted, which were featured in a Tramlines podcast, what could we learn from those trials that could be useful for this spring?
Yeah, I mean, that was a great example, actually, Tony, and thanks for bringing it up, because that field conditions were wet. We weren't, we were trying to direct drill, but that was not a direct drill scenario. The farm normally would use a solo, fairly deep cultivation system, and so we were trying to dive headlong into direct drilling. Soil conditions wet, so this friability we talk about was not really there, and what we did see was drills that were moving a bit more soil, going a little bit deeper, actually did fare slightly better. Where we were trying to go tentatively into a shallow slot or do a direct drill job, it really didn't work because soil conditions weren't right. And the one point, and it makes this point again, on that, in that particular project, the margin was improved by the crop performance. So that takes me back to that very start point. If the soil is not right, if the field's not right, then for goodness sake, we have to set it up for the autumn rather than do something this spring. There are ways to get us through that, because there are SFI options in terms of legume mixes, etc., that can and actually will help us set those or reset those soils, Tony.
And so to bring this podcast to a close, David, what would be your top tips for those who are listening today?
I mean, the first thing we spoke about most of them, obviously, but the first thing is to make an assessment. That doesn't have to be particularly sophisticated. It is a case of digging holes. It is a case of rolling soil in your hands, but it is coming back to this whole friability thing. And, if you haven't got that, and Steve makes that point really clearly, but, you're better off thinking about another option or going to another field. But by trying to force the agenda, really, you'll seriously compromise that crop thing. But if you then have agreed that scenario looks like it will drill very successfully, then it comes down to attention to detail. And it is about axle weights, it is about total weights, about tire pressures.
And Steve, what would you urge growers and farmers to think about before they travel on those fields this spring?
Soil assessments on a field by field basis. Then be realistic which fields will and won't make it in terms of provide a growing system for that crop. And then some real practical stuff, i.e. where are you going to fill that drill up? What about the headlands? 20% of that field probably is down to headlands. Actually, how are we going to turn on those? Have we got the right drill actually? Or should we bring something else in that's lighter and we can actually protect those headland areas? It's all of that that becomes so critical when soils are on the edge.
Thank you, David and Steve, for your valuable technical advice to help us navigate some key challenges this spring. That's it for this podcast, but do tune in again as we meet the experts throughout the season, exploring the many immediate and longer-term questions for growers and farmers in the UK. If you have any questions that you'd like us to ask the experts, email info@agrii.co.uk. See you next time.